We are in lecture number 3 for this week, and we're looking at G.K. Chesterton's book dealing with chapters 5 and 6, man, mythology, and then chapter 6, he talks about demons and philosophers. Now, you can tell by the background here that I'm doing this video in a different location than I normally do. No books behind me, trees. This is in my backyard here in Tennessee, and I decided to do this because it's a nice day outside. I can wear a jacket without sweating, and because we're dealing with some things here that take us back to people living in a mythological world where the natural world around them is pretty much what they knew, and they didn't know a whole lot else. They probably didn't have a nice deck rail like I do here, but nonetheless, that's where we are. Now, he's going to deal, first of all, here in chapter 5 with the whole issue of mythology and with what a myth is. I want to give a caveat or two before we get too deep into this. One of them is that sometimes in reading Chesterton, you don't get the entire context of what he wants to say in the same way that you do in reading Lewis. Now, there are many similarities between these two men. These men were both devout in their faith. Lewis was an Anglican and Chesterton was Roman Catholic. Very devout. They were public figures. Lewis was a university professor. Chesterton was a journalist and an author. And so they have very similar kind of a context. They're both speaking apologetically to a world in the early 20th century that's going crazy around them. But there certainly is a difference in style in the way that they deal with some of these issues. And that's one thing to keep in mind. Lewis always kind of tells us, this is where I'm going with this particular issue, and Chesterton doesn't always do that. The other caveat is, there's a lot of stuff in here about things not all of us know everything about. He presumes a certain amount of knowledge of Greek and German mythology and Roman mythology. He also presumes a certain amount of knowledge of English poetry. He talks about Shelley, talks about Shakespeare. Presumes even some knowledge about things that are related to the North American continent when he talks about Hiawatha, the great Native American chieftain. And so some of this we're not that familiar with. What this might do and ought to do is at some point behoove us to take a look at some of these things so that we can be a little bit more literate. It really also tells you that the kind of literate society that Chesterton came out of was a little different from ours. These were things that people were presumed to know. All right, into the issue of mythology. One of the things that he deals with here at some length is the idea that myths are oftentimes not pretty. In fact, there's this great quote where he says, one branch of the beautiful is the ugly. And this is something that is disturbing to us, but it's nonetheless true. So if you go back to the myths, whether they're ancient myths or medieval myths, think about Grimm's fairy tales. The original Grimm's fairy tales, not the ones that were cleaned up for your kids, but the real Grimm's fairy tales about the big bad wolf and Hansel and Gretel and all of those kinds of stories. Those stories were intended to be frightening, not nice little ditties that we read to our kids at bedtime. They read them to kids at bedtime in Germany when they were first being formulated in the medieval period. Kids probably wouldn't have slept well, and maybe that was part of the whole goal. I don't know. In our day and time, of course, we can see something of that because of the drift in the way that art has developed. If you go back to the Renaissance and Reformation periods, you have beautiful works of art. Michelangelo's Sistine ceiling, chapel of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. You have the great works of Rembrandt. You have Leonardo's Last Supper. These are all ideal and beautiful pieces of work. And you fast forward to the 20th century, and you get Picasso. And there's a great deal in Picasso and others of his ilk, even Salvador Dali, that is ugly and frightening. And yet what I think in part Picasso is trying to say is that in the realm of aesthetics, there is the ugly. And we just kind of have to recognize that that is true. He talks about how people have oftentimes attempted to explain the origin of myths or what it is that mythological figures are trying to point to. And he says there's all these theories, some of which may have some credibility, and then again, maybe not. He talks about how there are too many cryptograms in Shakespeare where everything is phallic, everything is totemistic, everything is seed time and harvest, everything is ghosts and grave offerings, everything is the golden bough of sacrifice. And certainly those elements must have been there in myths, because these are the ways that people in a non-philosophical and non-literate society were able to express themselves. But we can't always be overly confident that we know just what in the world they were trying to say. He wants to make it clear here that myths are not allegories. Myths are just pictures. They're just little glimpses into the way things might be. There's a wonderful discussion as he comes later on into the chapter about how myths are not really religions. And here he's going to delve not just into sort of primitivistic myths, but also some of the early attempts at expressing religious ideas based on nature. So he says there are the myths, these are the myths, and he who has no sympathy with myths has no sympathy with men. I like that. I think that we do that. We have some understanding of that. But he who has the most sympathy with myths will most fully realize that they are not and never were a religion, in the sense that Christianity or even Islam is a religion. They satisfy some of the needs that are initiated by religion, but they never quite get there. And then he has the interesting statement that myths provide men with a calendar, but not with a creed. So myths are these things that delve deep into the subconscious, that were part of the life of ancient people, and to some degree still today. Think of dreams, nightmares. Oftentimes in our own nightmares we are confronted with frightening and terrifying things, and there may be some sense in which that harkens back to that old need for a picture or an image or a story that relates part of what life is all about. And he gets into this as he talks about Greco-Roman religion and German religion, or Scandinavian religion. So in the Greco-Roman religions, which are more familiar to us, you have Zeus and Jupiter and Apollo and Diana and all of those gods and goddesses. But really they're just an expression of nature. So Neptune is the sea. And so you pray to the god Neptune, when you go to sail. But you're really kind of just praying to the sea. It's given some kind of personification, but it's not really a full-blown religion in the way we think of it. Same thing is true with the Scandinavian religions that talk about Odin and Thor. And he points out here in this chapter that Odin was really kind of like an ancient warrior figure, this gigantic, larger-than-life guy that won many battles, and that Thor is not really a god, he's just sort of a hero. And I don't know if you're a fan of the series that's been on for the last couple of years, The Vikings. It's very interesting, and even if you've not seen it, I think you'll understand what I'm about to say. And that is that there's this one figure that comes along early in the series. His name is Athelstan, and he's a Catholic priest. And there are two men in the series that develop a great deal of appreciation for and affection for Athelstan, and one of them is the King of Wessex, that is English king, Egbert, and the other is the king of the Northmen, the Vikings, and his name is Ragnar. And they both love Athelstan, and I can't help but think that part of what the authors of that series are gesturing at is that Athelstan has something that their religions do not. Even though Egbert himself is a Christian, he's a Catholic Christian, but he operates more on the level of paganism, more on the level of mythology. And so this is, I think, a helpful chapter. Again, it's kind of enigmatic, but I don't believe that you'll have a hard time with it. And I think that it does open up a way of thinking about things that helps us understand the progress of thought. Now, chapter 6, Demons and Philosophers, we have a little less time to deal with this, but what he's talking about here is another stage in the development. When we move from mythology to the development of religions, religions that grow out of mythologies, he essentially wants to say that oftentimes those first gestures toward religions in some ways take a turn backwards. We talked in a previous lecture about how the original religion apparently was monotheism. That's established by archaeology, one God. But by the time we get down into it, we get into paganism and mythology, and then eventually polytheism and henotheism, and then back finally to monotheism. But he deals, for instance, here with the Canaanites and the Phoenicians and others who inhabited places like Tyre and Sidon. And he says that what has happened here is religion has become corrupt in the way we would think about it today. So there's much discussion of human sacrifice. The same thing is true with those people who lived in Central America and in the northern part of South America when the conquistadors first came over here in the late 15th and early 16th century. They found a people well developed. And the point that he's going to make here is that civilization has often in the past driven cultures to elevate the most demonic ways of thinking about the faith. And those demonic ways include the sacrifice of infants, the sacrifice of virgins, think of the Aztec religious scheme, and so on. And he spends a great deal of time about that. And part of his purpose for doing this is nicely put by him, is that ever since the time of Rousseau, writing in the early 19th century, late 18th, early 19th century, we've had this idea of the noble savage. And in fact, Rousseau spent a great deal of capital talking about the noble savage. And that, if you get away from civilization, you'll find a primitive people, and they love one another, and they have a wonderful economic system, and everything goes fine with their civilization. And his point is that's just not true. That there's sin in the heart of all people, and that no matter what kind of civilization you see developing, it's going to have these demonic elements unless there is something that is of true redemption that is introduced. And so he spends a good deal of time dealing with that. If you look at page 75, for instance, he said that these people, he doesn't mention Rousseau by name, but I know who he's talking about. These people always assumed that before the advent of Europe, there was nothing anywhere but Eden. And the fact is that there was not Eden. There was hell here before the advent of European civilization. I think that this is a very helpful observation to make. And then in the last part of this chapter 6, he deals with the rise, beginning in the 6th century BC, of a new approach that he calls philosophy. And I want to say a couple things about it very quickly here, because I think it's important to get this. Gautama the Buddha, Confucius, we call Confucius, Socrates, many of these people that began to bring about a more enlightened approach to understanding all arose in the 6th century BC, at the same time as Daniel and Ezekiel, the prophets of the Old Testament. Remember that Paul said that Christ came in the fullness of times, and that God had sort of prepared the world for the coming of Christ. He doesn't say that, but I think he wanted to say that. I think if he'd listened to me give this lecture, he would have said, let me add a paragraph to what I said. Very helpful, very keen understanding of human nature and the need we have to be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks.